Hi, Mark Miller here, co-founder of All Day DevOps, getting set up for the second block of the day. This is going to be the first keynote of the day with Amelie Coran. Amelie, you and I were talking before we got on. I was saying I'm having difficulty wrapping my head around all the things that you've done. For those of you that haven't followed her in the past, Amelie was actually did policy analysis for the Obama White House. She did, you were working with Digital Services and Open Source Data Initiative. You worked with a lot of people that I've known in the industry, and it's been fascinating to see all this stuff. Amelie, can you turn your mic on and we can kind of talk here a little bit to get you started?
Yes.
There you go. So thanks. When you try to introduce yourself to people, how do you do that?
For the longest time, I had Jane of all trades on LinkedIn. I think, one of the great matches between me and kind of the goal of All Day DevOps is I've kind of done that full stack. I've done development, some of it my own time, operations. I graduated college and immediately kind of wanted to learn to be a system engineer and system admin, and then kind of fell into security for the bulk of my career. So having an understanding of just everything and the intricacies and being that I've done this for over 25 years, it's just you've seen the industry kind of grow. For me, when I introduce myself to people, it's like I have the empathy. It's like I've been where you've been, and I can kind of grok what everyone kind of generally says. There's a lot of stuff I've got to be learning every day, but just that is one of those interesting things when I meet people.
It was interesting to hear your story about how you were first introduced to the White House and how you did that when you said they just put a stack of papers in front of me and said, "Here you go."
Yeah, that was you don't get any spin up time. It's basically they want you in there because of your skill set, and they expect you to kind of start from scratch. It's the ultimate startup role. If you're there for most of the people in the White House are all there as rotational opportunities. So folks come in for 6, 12, 18 months at a time, sometimes a little bit longer than that, depending on what they do. And you're there, you burn through what you got to do. Sometimes you get tapped in to kind of do a lot of other stuff as well. But it's an amazing experience. And, most people get exposed to, government civics like 101 in high school or college, but this is, your 400 graduate level kind of stuff they don't teach in school. And it was an interesting experience.
That's great. Can you give us like a quick overview? What are you going to cover today?
So, having done that entire stack and kind of where I'm at right now, I'm a deputy CIO. So I find myself in more of a managerial role now, but I'm also leading teams of technologists to deliver on promises for modernization and new development and so forth. And one of the things that I've learned is trying to understand the difference between your management speak, your leadership skills and whatnot, and then your more technical skills. And for me, it was a concept around zero. From the business school side of things, there's always a drive to reduce or to get as close to a minimal loss as possible and see that as a profit. And that concept of zero is extremely powerful. And what I want to cover here is how folks can kind of use that to leverage that common language, but also help bring the leadership to an understanding of what we're doing with DevOps, and then have the folks who do DevOps be able to better explain and advocate for their own position with leadership.
Excellent. I'm going to step into the background here if you want to share your slide deck.
No problem.
We'll get you started.
All right,
have fun.
Thanks. So again, my name is Amelie Coran. I'm here from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Inspector General's Office. It's a subcomponent of a very large federal agency. But in my time, I've actually had experience in both the private and public sector, but also academic. A couple of Fortune 125 companies, non-governmental organizations, several federal agencies, and even startups, including one I started, back in the late 90s. But I've touched critical infrastructure, entertainment, technology, finance, manufacturing, R&D, and consulting. And as I mentioned before, when Mark introduced me, I've done the full stack. So, that development of empathy for technologists kind of helps me be an advocate in my role, kind of being a unicorn to make sure that the folks that I work with are accurately represented. Things I like to do in the free time. I'm a motorcyclist. I picked that up for kind of shits and giggles. Started a triathlon just to challenge myself. Love snow skiing. I collect toys and music, much to the chagrin of my spouse. And my zen is actually building Lego models. I've known people in my office come in and they're just like amazed. It's like walking into a kid's playroom with the toys, but also just tons and tons of Lego models. So that's just a little background of my strangeness beyond what the introduction was about. But, the key thing is, why am I talking about what I'm talking about when it comes to this in a DevSecOps talk? One of those key things that I found from going to hacker conferences, security conferences, and other technology conferences is that technologists are really bad at advocating, for their own self, their own work. And one of those things is to demonstrate the value of what they bring to an organization. A lot of times technologists, especially in the operational side of things, and even security, are just thought of kind of as a cost center. We give you money, and I don't necessarily, kind of conceptualize what I get out of it, short of, my email is up, or, several months down the road, I get an application to solve a problem I asked about. And one of those cases is also learning to manage the expectations of both your direct leadership, so your IT director or your development lead, but also executive leadership to say that, we can try to move mountains, but you got to realize we got to start out with a small hill to begin with before we can kind of deliver you that full mountain range. And conversely is to have you as technologists, most of you, understand how leadership views you. And how you can tie that into the mission of your organization, your company, the goals, whether or not it be you're developing a new product from the startup phase to where you're potentially in a multi-100-year-old company or organization, and you're trying to kind of get it to kind of get modernized. And definitely how you can leverage it to your advantage. There's lots of little tips and tricks that you can do. So for me, I started with the concept of zero. And that's a very, very powerful number. Most people kind of think, zero is the absence of things. But what it is it's actually kind of that grounding point. And Brahmagupta, back in the 7th century, was the first person to kind of develop that unified theory of zero. And it's very powerful. Obviously, in technology, you have the concept of 1 and 0 for binary of existence, non-existence. When you're doing the math, how that affects the positivity or negativity of a number. So it's extremely, just you look at it at the technical sense, it's a great thing to kind of spin around. But a lot of times you're thinking in business, and even just the basic concept of zeros is understand significance. Anywhere from it's the 10th or 100th place all the way to the billionth of a place. So the significance. My spouse gets regularly tested for a disease that they have, and the fact that you've got to drill down to deeper tests in order to find, or the lack of existence of the particular issue in their makeup. When you don't see it, that's very important. And that's usually designated by that radix point, that point. You have a 1, but on that other side, that's, sometimes that really kind of defines how significant that appearance is, but also the magnitude, like how big something is. If you tell somebody, you got a 10 times improvement, maybe a millionth time improvement over a process or the shortness of a time is just as important. So you're using zero as a positional notation. And then as mentioned before, the absence or existence, the on or off, the 1 versus 0. And in business that, most business leaders don't get to that level of technicality, but they are taught, in finance or, profit loss, generally kind of, how close they want to get to a 0, either the gain or the loss, as I mentioned in the beginning. So a lot of times leadership is taught about game theory, the whole concept of zero sum. And it's based on utility, like how useful is I'm going to get actually out of what I do based on, the difference from that core point, that kind of that radix point, the plus or minus zero. And a lot of times when you do that, everyone's kind of striving for like a zero loss. Like if they put an investment in, the idea is that they want to see as little loss that they would see as, I gave you, say, $1 million to develop a product. I want to see all of that $1 million in the end result. And I don't want to, be in the red, as the concept is. But for also gain too is, for me, now I've moved into management. The goal for me nowadays is to ensure that I've fully executed my budget. The fact that I get as close to a zero difference between a fully executed budget and the end of the year is important, because that means I've successfully executed on what I've promised to do, and I've allocated all my resources to what they're properly supposed to be assigned to. And if you've been in operational standpoint, you've been probably asked for dashboards, and a lot of times, those zeros will make up a score for, say, a key performance indicator, or kind of tracking the status of an event, and that's kind of where this is driven out of. So a lot of times you get into the question that I started asking myself back when I started my first Fortune 100 company was, when I leave for the day, what have I done to make an organization more or less secure or resilient? And it's very personal to what you do for the organization. If you're a developer, for you it could be the least amount of errors as possible, or zero flaws. For security people, it's a matter of zero incidents. The idea of paying for the existence, the non-existence of event is extremely powerful. However, a lot of times management doesn't kind of conceptualize like, why am I paying for nothing, essentially? And that gets down to measuring whether or not it's a qualitative or quantitative. I put qualitatively and qualitatively in there, but should have been quantitatively and qualitatively. A collection thereof, or was it the warm and fuzzy that you did? Did you feel good as a measure? What was the magnitude of resources expended to achieve this? Was it one person that managed to get the goal, or did it require a team of hundreds of people to get there? Can you communicate this out to other members of your organization who are not technologists, who are leadership or HR or budget, or even folks who perform an entirely different function, maybe audit, or maybe there's a law enforcement arm, selling the value of what you do out to other parts of the organization that have no concept of actually kind of what you actually do on a day-to-day basis. So the concept of zero and trying to sell yourself up is very, very powerful on the day-to-day stuff that most people don't, in the technology realm, want to get their hands dirty in. It's budget justifications, saying like, I need some resources, some money to get this, say for modernization, trying to plot out that I'm adapting my platform from an on-premises, tons of servers and hardware that we're maintaining O&M on, to we're moving it to a cloud environment, and we've got a continuous integration pipeline that we're trying to develop, and we need this money to kind of both cover what we're doing in the basic operations now to where we're eventually going to be in a cloud and eventually reduce that kind of cost. Justifying your headcount. A lot of times if you look at something like the mythical man month, the idea that, some management people just want to kind of throw more folks at a problem in hopes that it gets solved. But sometimes, a better application of the skill sets and types of staff and resources you have is, when you can tie that back into an actual outcome and what you're getting, the magnitude of benefit from that is extremely important. A lot of times too is we've gone through something at HHS called Reimagine, and within our own division, we looked at a technology track basically. And one of the things we really kind of stressed with the folks who we're working with was identifying business processes. So what do you start with and what do you end with? But let's not say I did this with SharePoint as a workflow tool or whatever. Just remove technology from it. And that is a key thing to, technologists to try to extract themselves from saying, well, I've got a tool that can solve this. And a lot of times even the folks who are not technologists will come in and say that, hey, I want to use this tool. I've always used this tool, and kind of expect that you can maybe solve this by just removing a step out of a process. Again, too, is technology capability. You probably have had managers that have come in and said that they've read something in a magazine and why aren't we doing it? And a lot of time the pushback is we're not mature enough to do it. So one of those things is you can say that, well, from the starting point to this end point, we will get to this level of maturity, we'll adapt to this technology, and we'll have these enablers. Again, too, is using the concepts of zeros and the deviance from thereof on delivery time. Everyone knows, they've got to roll out a minimum viable product or another release if you're doing something more traditional, and letting them know that in a couple sprints we'll have something for you. But for them to understand that you can do shorter sprints or you can do longer sprints, but how that kind of deviates from your typical expectations and what business leaders tend to conceptualize that, sometimes magically technology appears after we throw some resources at that. And then again, too, tying back to maturity is the complexity of operations. Some folks don't know what works behind the covers. And, using basic math with a dashboard sometimes satisfies their needs, but for you as a developer, you want a little bit more math. You're looking at the ever increasing backlog of work that you have, and management will always say, well, why isn't that zero? Why isn't that closer to zero? And those are the things that you end up having to communicate out. So another thing to be very frank about, my degree was in decision support systems. And that is essentially all the tools that we end up using as technologists and hope to kind of share out to management, is that it's a decision support system. But it also comes from the sake of having, leadership have informed question asking. But you need to ask these same questions yourself. So what do these numbers actually mean? Like when I tell somebody it's 100, is there a meaningful behind that? Is it 100%? Is it 100 out of 1,000? It gets back to that concept of zero. It's a tens place. Or a hundreds place that you're drilling down into understanding, like out of something, that's where we're at. And then also, do the questions address the organization's mission? Like if you have management sometimes come by and say, well, I want to view into your backlog, and is this actually satisfying the mission? Sometimes no, it's not, because they don't need to know the details. And you as somebody who's providing that information needs to let management know and be willing to say no, that I'm not going to provide this because it doesn't provide meaning, and it's going to get people potentially micromanaging you or sticking their nose into things that particularly they're not expertise in, and can kind of stir the pot when you don't need them to. So, you can direct them to ask, kind of better questions when they do ask you to provide numbers. And then again, what problem is being solved? If they're asking a question just for the sake of feeling like they want to participate in the discussion, or are they asking questions that would potentially help you solve a particular problem? Asking how many servers you have in your environment doesn't necessarily get to the point of what it's going to take to potentially modernize your environment. Server counts sometimes don't matter because servers do different things. And when you do ask questions or you're providing reporting back out, it helps alert to strategy. And what I mean by that is, you may have an enterprise architect who's working across all the business units, and they've developed this lovely, perfect roadmap. We want to get from point A to point B to point Z. And a lot of those times is you need to ask the questions is like, what it's going to take to get from point A to point B, or what it's going to take to get from point A to point Z. Are there lots of smaller questions? Is it just kind of a death march? And asking those questions will really kind of help you direct, does the work that you do affect the bottom line? Are you burning resources faster than you're generating income for your organization? Or in certain cases in the public sector, with the challenge of budgets that government employees and technologists have to deal with, is, with the meager amount of money a lot of times we have, what kind of success can we get during the time that we've actually have those funds? We've got to prioritize. And then, typically a lot of times for management, it's always about return on investment. And the strangest thing about technology is you can't really quantify an honest to goodness ROI sometimes, because sometimes you have to invest in that. Security people definitely know this. Having to justify, why you need an endpoint protection tool. Well, if we didn't have it on there and someone clicked on, a malware linked site, if we don't have any level of protections on there, it'll spread and you'll just see this major loss. So it gets back to what I mentioned before about trying to shoot for the zero existence of an event. That's actually a return on an investment, but people can't typically conceptualize that as an investment. And I'll cover a little bit of reasons why in just a moment. So I see this as plays. When I was at the White House, they created the digital services playbook. And the concept of a play is a action one can kind of take within their own organization or their sphere of influence to kind of affect outcome. That helps with teaming, helps you find the right people you need to collaborate with or you need to have on your team. If you are in a DevSecOps or just a DevOps environment, kind of finding the right people with the right skill sets to affect your outcome. Building a communications awareness program. I think sometimes in some of the organizations I've been at, we've suffered horribly from poor or lack of clear communication, but that also affects your customers. If you're not being transparent and making them aware of what's going on, they have those muddled expectations of what they're going to get in return. I think one of our biggest powerful outcomes most recently was to involve a lot of our senior leadership who are not developers, who are not technologists in design sprints. Getting them involved as to what we do was a great play that we put on with our organization, and we've got now people supporting us and willing to be more patient about our delivery. Another play is skills development. Sometimes you may have people in your organization that have a hidden skill set or hidden desire to grow. We've had some folks that have been very close to retirement in our technology group, but they've picked up skills for agile coaching and cloud development skills, understanding pipelines that in a typical waterfall environment we're not asked to do that, that made them more powerful. And I think some of the folks we've had now have become most useful folks we've had in our organization because they bring in that history and that knowledge, and they've now been able to translate that over to our new modern environment. And then, the applicability of the work that you do to the business mission. For us, sometimes, as a public sector employee, that's the reason a lot of folks are actually in public sector, because they can see a tie to mission. For a case where we had we deployed iPhones out to some of our agents, and they were involved in a very, very newsworthy event, but I was never really connected necessarily with our internal customers, because it was like, well, we're doing iPhones, we're providing email, whatever. And I didn't see a connection until that news story came out. So that gives you a chance to kind of go, okay, this is the reason I'm here. This is why I'm doing this. It gives you that connection. And then, what do I do to make things better? I always joked one of my first jobs that I was working on automating myself out of my job. And that's an optimization. That's where you're trying to kind of conform to that curve, that line as to what the plans are of efficiencies. So the play one is metaphors. So I kind of consider myself the queen of metaphors. I use them all the time to try to get management to buy into an idea. I gave a keynote earlier this year down here in Florida, of course, and talked about bringing back the use of cultural touchstones, such as quotes from movies like Ghostbusters and whatnot, just because my peers have probably seen those movies and they get the joke, and it gets them to kind of loosen up with a laugh. But the other useful things for a metaphor is it's a touchstone. So why do I have to do X? You're always being asked to kind of potentially do the impossible sometimes. And I'll use, a cybersecurity item as a placeholder. So executives can typically conceptualize like locks on a door, guards at entrances. It's a physical presence. They see it, they can grok it, it's touch and feel, it's a tactile kind of feedback. But most of them can't conceptualize, say, antivirus or network monitoring or anything like that. So a concept there is to use a metaphor to bridge that gap. And one of the most useful ones is an actuarial model, such as health insurance. You kind of pay in for it and you get coverage. So your premium is what kind of covers these things, even though you may not need them, they may not happen. The occurrence of those may be low. It's not necessarily a low occurrence event, but it's always there just in case something happens. Business school people get that. They're taught actuarial models because it deals with understanding how risk applies in an organization, how they have to mitigate it, they have to accept it. But risks are complex and they're diversified. Not every organization has the same amount of risks for operations as the next one down the road. A power company has a different risk profile than someone who's just developing, say, like Uber for mobile apps and transportation. They're different. They're different industries, but also their risk profiles are different. And again, as I mentioned, they can conceptualize because it's tactile about locks on a door and guards at entrances. But a digital representation is still a little foreign. So the use of metaphors are extremely good for bridging that gap. So you don't try to talk tech. You talk in terms of something they're familiar with. So again, kind of health insurance is that thing where you can kind of use that as the bridge that goes across that gap. So risk as a concept is born out of the financial industry. Anybody who tells you differently is totally lying. So you're trying to save money by shooting for a zero loss, that non-event that I mentioned very much earlier on. And that can be part of the planning process. My goal is to reduce or get to as close to zero as possible. So going back to that concept. And like insurance, you're spending a little to hedge against a greater loss. So sometimes numbers look a little weird when you start to apply them. So the magnitude of an expense versus return is important. So if I spend $100 to get 80% coverage, is actually better for you, even though it's more expensive than spending $20 for a known 10% of coverage. And when you can kind of explain that you've got to spend a little to save a little, that is actually a strong concept that they will get. It's preventative maintenance. The idea that it's good that we're not running on legacy hardware. After 3 or 5 years, you're in a refresh cycle. You build that into your budget. You build that into your planning, your operational downtime, maintenance windows, and so forth. Those are the types of things that you need to communicate to management. And using metaphors like this for management will actually gain you much more respect and much more trust, because then they understand it. You realize that you're not kind of trying to pull a blanket over them, or you're trying to, I hate to say the term, but bullshitting them. You're really trying to get to them at their level, and they'll take the extra effort to kind of understand where you're coming from. And again, with risk, is you're spending this type of resources on here, you're trying to inoculate against a higher probability event. But a lot of times those smaller, less probable events get caught up in that. So the fact that you have insurance coverage that in case you have a broken arm or you have a regular screening for a chronic disease, but you also get the benefit of getting covered for getting your flu shot. And that's one of those small things that you don't think about, but it's covered by that because it's just something that's part of that planning process. And that's that little expense to get kind of a herd immunity. Another play is participation. And this is a very, very, very strong one. This is having a seat at the table. And for that I've looked at some of the talks, some of the abstracts here, and folks are actually talking about including folks in for tabletop exercises to perform root cause analysis when you have an error or a major issue with, say, an integration pipeline, or there was a deployment, or you have something that's happened with your app that was unexpected, even though you've gone through planning and caught all the user stories that you need to. And including folks who are not technologists in that is important as well, because they can kind of see the effort that you've gone through, but sometimes they can actually provide a perspective that typically you're not going to get if you kind of run a culture of just technologists at the table. And they also get a better feel for the level of effort that's required that you guys put into your day-to-day work. Again, as I mentioned before, we've gone through design sprints. Having senior leadership in the room who are typically not, writing code or actually doing architecture and design, they end up lending a lot of interesting perspectives. They could make your life easier because they can say, well, you may have conceptualized that I need this, but I don't actually need that. Folks who've been through this process with leadership or with other customers, it's proven to be an extremely powerful tool. And I highly recommend it because I've seen us do amazing things in the 2 years I've been at my current organization because we've gotten people to buy in at this level. Open brainstorming and scenario-based discussions. Not everybody can think of everything, and having you participate in that, that goes to the next one, strategy and planning sessions, when folks are laying out what you're supposed to do over the next couple months, couple years, even a couple weeks, being there at the table to say, hey, this is impossible, or we can only do this percentage of things. That's setting that expectations, managing the expectations, you're managing up. Again, to zero is you can say, like, we can go from 0 to 10. It's just as important as going to 0 to 100, but you're doing it incrementally. You're doing it in a measured fashion. You're setting those goals and you're setting those expectations, and folks can understand the types of resources that you're going to need to do that. Again, at budget planning review, technology people, I'm sure, hate being asked to participate in budget, but that's also very important because I sit with my own budget director, who I've recently hired. There's those concepts of fighting the whole policy and process that they may actually have to go under, but because I have somebody on my team who's does that with me, I can meet from the explanation of saying, this is what this line item means. And they can meet me with going, well, you need to spend this type of money at this point in time because there's a whole other process for buying things that takes an inordinate amount of time that most people who are technology people never get into. When you have a clock running between 30 days and 0 days when you have to complete your budget for the year, knowing and having that shared understanding is extremely, extremely important. And I know a lot of organizations have gotten in the habit of building brown bag and lunch and learns, and where folks can kind of casually drop in. It's that passive awareness, which I spoke about earlier, is making folks aware, extremely, extremely important. And that's that point of participation as a play is people feel part of a process. And I think as folks move from a typical, on-prem legacy environment to a more modern, agile, cloud-based or even hybrid environment, having people kind of sit in, understand what's going on, builds that anticipation. They become your advocates. You spend less time fighting because people are actually taking that message from the mount and going down to the unwashed and doing that marketing for you. And it's extremely, extremely powerful. So the outcomes from that, it provides a more visceral connection between the staff that you're working with. It has everyone buy into the goals that you're trying to do. And, everyone tends to understand what the tie is into operations and mission. So, as I noted before, is I didn't have a connection with some of our organization, and we saw an event that they supported. And it was like, all right, yeah, I get it now. I get why I come into work every day. Sometimes the days where I just want to kind of fall asleep because I didn't get enough sleep, I need to participate because I see that connection. And because we've been involved we've shared stuff out through communications, we've participated in brown bags, they've been in design sprints, we have that connection, and it's extremely powerful, and it gives you a lot of self-worth. And again, participation removes a lot of communications barriers. You start to learn how to communicate with other folks. We have a law enforcement branch. I don't understand most of the stuff they do. They deal with guns, they deal with surveillance, all sorts of weird, cool James Bond type kind of stuff. But when they come to our meetings and they participate in a design sprint and they spend the time to kind of walk us through it, those communication barriers get dropped. And we shorten the amount of time it takes to get from what's in their head out to what needs to be in our head in order to deliver stuff to them. There's an empathy that's created. As I mentioned earlier in my introduction, having done development, having done operations, having done security, I've developed an empathy with all of the folks that I end up having to lead. But, for me, I think also is my operations staff and my security people and my developers understand that I'm someone they can trust because that I've been through the same level of frustration. So when they come to me and say, hey, we've got a delay, we've got an issue, I can be their advocate so they can spend more time solving the problem and I can go fight for their on their behalf. And again, awareness is enabled. You are definitely, making sure that you're valued, you're known, you're not just some black box. So, involving people in that participation pays back in massive, massive dividends. Finally, is play 3 is conceptualization. So, as I mentioned before about communications, is one of the first things we do when a new project is develop a lexicon, and it's common, it's shared, it's opened, and you take the time to agree on what things are supposed to mean. So if you have a particular concept, spend the time to say, this is what this means. In the federal government, I believe we had a thing called Data Center Consolidation Initiative, and the definition of what was a data center evolved over about 7 years, but it kept being a moving target and it caused a lot of frustration. Anywhere from folks who think a data center is, hundreds of racks and hundreds of servers and needs to be all this super complex stuff to where it was down to, you have a networking closet with a server and a switch. That's also a data center. And that changed how things were reported. It changed how leadership planned for activities, the cost involved with that, what fell under regulations. So if you don't initially have that common lexicon, those common definitions, it can cause you a lot of pain down the road. And taking that time up front, building it in at the front, most security people would dream of being able to build things in at the front. It's a good strategy to do that with anything with development and operations as well. As once you have it, everyone's on board, and it makes communications a lot easier. Also, helps frame the discussion. If I say this is what this means, there's no ambiguity, and allows you to set goals. It allows you to set numbers, towards statistics for reporting. When you talk about this is, I've got to buy these servers, and this is what a server means. This type of server, this capability, that's a set cost. So you can do planning, you can be more accurate. And again, it goes back to 0 as a significance. You can get within 100th or 1,000% of executing on that because you've clearly communicated what that all means. And the cool thing, too, about a common lexicon and defining everything is referential and clarity. You can always go back to it. It's that shared knowledge. If you write it down, you put it in a wiki, you print it out, you have it posted on the wall in a poster or something like that. It's always there. It's clear, but it also allows knowledge transfer. If you have something like a wiki for developing your architecture or tools that you're using, as people roll on and off a project, that's something that you can just point them to. They go there, they get up to speed very quickly. It's clear, it's concise, and it allows for other folks to participate in documentation as well. I mentioned the flexibility of a wiki. We were pushing that at our organization just recently for policy review and development, having a living document. Doesn't necessarily potentially change meanings. I mean, if you're using that as a place for your definitions, you have some policy, some governance around that. But it also allows folks who have a skill set potentially outside the initial group that were developing those terms and definitions to add nuance, to add kind of color to that. But you also, if folks don't have time, they can kind of drop in and add their 2 cents to it. It's essentially like, writing everything with track changes on. You're always going to get a conversation about that. And again, too, clear communication at an organizational level removes stress and anxiety. Like, when you try to deliver a message, a lot of times you're going into meetings like, well, how is it going to land? If I'm going to upset somebody, is someone going to take something the wrong way? Or just the sake is, if you're presenting, you're not someone who's a good public speaker. I don't consider myself one. Knowing that everyone's on board definitely reduces that stress and anxiety. I say it engenders trust because you're more willing to be open and transparent about it. You've laid everything out on the table. You're not embargoing anything. By that, it also reduces questions, frees up resources. You're not constantly trying to explain the same thing to everybody. You can just kind of page slap them and say, hey, go here. This is where we define everything. And I note here is a force multiplier. This is a military term, but the fact is it's go forth and propagate. When you have folks that can go in and learn on their own, go to a knowledge base, they're your best advocates. They know what's going on. They see that you're being transparent about that, and they can go and your customers can then be your advocates for your own resources, and that frees your resources up, as well as having to potentially fight for budget, fight for resources, justify an existence, or as you argue for time, it's like, hey, I need more time to do this. If it's well documented and clear, it's always a case for management to say, okay, I get where you're going with this, and noting that. A lot of times, if you're starting a new project, I think one of the things I was noting here at Gartner, where I'm at right now, reuse is a big thing. I know developers love to kind of say go out to Quora and cut and paste. Sometimes that's maybe not the best reuse, but if you're potentially, you have a GitHub type of environment or Git repository, having well-defined libraries have gone under analysis by your security teams, that enables reuse. The rework of having to reinvent the wheel potentially is reduced as well. And it's always a good jumping off point. So, I'm sure a lot of you all have been through projects that have gone down a road and have been stopped, but they also provide a good jumping off point, because if you've documented them and you've been clear about like where you've gotten so far in a project, other teams can come back to that. It goes to that reuse point, but it's also a good jumping off point. If you ran down a road, but you documented it well, it keeps people from basically doing the same mistakes twice. So now story time. This is actually the crux of what I wanted to do, and within the last 20 minutes here, we'll touch a little bit on it. As Mark and I were talking about earlier, I may have spent some time at the White House. It was only 6 months, and I've been in this for 25 years. So what have I been doing for the other 24 and a half years? I've seen things, if you want to reuse the line from Blade Runner, that you can't believe. I've been at a critical infrastructure company during a hurricane, having to deal with cleanup after that, having to deal with uptime, because if the service you were providing went down, people could die. Before in the green room, Mark and I were talking about, he was working with a repository for OpenSSL during Heartbleed. I was at the White House during that time, and then we had two different perspectives on how people reacted, how people handled that problem. And when you are building your development teams, your operations and security teams, drawing from a diverse background, both from experience and skill levels, is incredibly important. So I mentioned earlier about dashboards. I used to roll my eyes every time executives wanted a dashboard. And it was annoying. When I mentioned that critical infrastructure company, that was the first time back in the early 2000s I've heard someone actually want a dashboard. And a lot of times, we're talking about the concepts of zeros. They want things kind of summed up in a single number. So what does that number mean? With Department of Homeland Security, they have a program called Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation, and they roll everything up into an RSA Archer dashboard. And you look at it and you go, what does this do to help me understand the risk profile for my agency or my organization? But is it a quantitative? Is it counts of vulnerabilities, so counts of systems? Or is it qualitative, like, with those vulnerabilities, how bad are those vulnerabilities? That's more of a qualitative count of your risk is a qualitative score. It's not a number. It's like 100% at risk doesn't really mean anything. That's a qualitative count of potentially how bad it is. You're giving shades to it. So you have to ask those questions of what they really want to get answered out of something like a dashboard. And what decision is it intended to support? If you count as many vulnerabilities you have in a solution, or errors in your code, what is it supporting? Or is it going to get you to have more development resources? Is it going to get them to slow down the expectations of delivery? Or is it actually helping solve a problem or issue? Like, I noted before about budget, that could potentially be a problem. If you don't have enough resources to solve the problem, the problem itself is a lack of resources. So if you have a dashboard saying that your backlog is growing exponentially, you may not have enough resources assigned to that project. And a dashboard like that explains the reason this keeps growing is because we don't have enough people on it. That, from a management perspective, can go, okay, I can start doing my planning. I can start laying out a strategy. I can manage the expectations among customers. So that's one of those tie-ins to dashboards. Of always be willing to push back on those questions that folks ask. They want something pretty. It doesn't need to be pretty. And touching again about what's presented, is it done in a manner that is it actionable? As I noted, the single number or color, that everyone wants a traffic light dashboard. What does red mean? What does green mean? Culturally, that could be different. In certain countries, stoplights are horizontal. Other times are vertical. I know visiting the UK for the first time, coming from the US, that you go immediately from red to green. Well, from there it goes red, yellow, green. It gives you time to kind of start. Understanding the cultural significance of that is also very important when you're presenting data like that. So always be willing to kind of push back to management and say, what does this all mean? So again, kind of talking about story time here is what necessarily sparked this talk. So Mark reached out to me after being contacted by Chris Roberts after me commenting on a Brian Krebs article from July of this year about hackers breaching a Virginia bank twice in 8 months. I mean, that's, pretty significant that you've been pwned twice in basically less than a year. Now, they had cyber breach insurance, but it had all these different classifications and whatnot. And as I mentioned before about using metaphors of health insurance, the idea of cyber insurance is they've applied that insurance actuarial model to system and operational risk. And from a management perspective, I've run this at organizations, the NGOs I've supported, federal space, private sector, academia. When you're done responding to the first issue, it's out of sight, out of mind. For some of you who may be here in the United States, Equifax is a great example of that. Like, everyone threw their arms up and said, "Oh my gosh, my data's been stolen. What are we going to do about it?" And we're here over a year later, and short of, hey, I'm going to give you credit monitoring, we haven't gone back to solve the problem. People have patched the systems, but we haven't really addressed those issues. And with this bank, that was one of those cases of there was really no follow-up. They're just continuing down the same road potentially. And leadership at the time found it more cost-effective to just try to collect and fight the lawyers for this, and rather than fix the original flaws. You saw that potentially with Equifax with the Struts vulnerability. It was just not part of their process. One of those things would be if you were actively involved, you had leadership part of those development teams, part of the process for root cause analysis, that they would, that would engender a process change where, when this happens, you go through, you address your policy, you address your operations, you try to fix those flaws. But they played the odds about, this will never happen. This is a once in a lifetime thing, that million-year flood or the 100-year hurricane or whatever. And it covers up the whole concept of potential negligence that actually occurred. If you don't build in security from the front, you're going to get owned. If you're not building in an integration pipeline, you're going to end up having flaws, or you're going to have duplication of work, or you're going to have branches of configurations that aren't being very well managed. So you use that as, I consider that as experiential learning for this behavior change. So if you've experienced it, you're willing to actually go and make a change. And a lot of times you talk to security people and they talk about this metaphorical black swan event. It's the near zero probability mindset. Like, we'll never get hit by a hurricane, or we'll never have a power outage. If you're talking like Amazon potentially, we'll never is the typical thing. And that zero, it's zero probability this will happen, but it will, because they don't rationalize it properly. They suffer from the sake of, we kind of did this and we recovered, but it'll never happen again. So they don't want to change that behavior. And really, when you go through these tabletop exercises, these scenario finding activities, it can actually help with a better design outcome, with a better architecture, with, justifying, when you talk about, I need to spend $100 to get 80%. And if you give me another $5, I can get you 85%. Because you've included those concept of those black swan events, but also normal operations. That $5 that may be covering the black swan event can be repurposed in the year if it doesn't happen to help with another tool, or that was a resource that could be reallocated to support some other activity that you have as part of your DevOps environment. It's just one of those cases of working the numbers in order to speak to leadership and management on their own behalf, but also note that if you don't think about it, it will still occur. It's just that you won't be prepared for it. And as I mentioned there, the expectations of a near zero, getting that down to zero, doesn't mean it will never happen. It's just that it's part of your planning. If they think it'll never happen, they won't be willing to participate. They won't exercise those brain cells. And even throwing those things out, don't always design for the black swan event either. Don't be the one saying, well, we've got to build in everything from the start. But even if you just conceptualize, like you have mitigating controls and other compensating capabilities in there, that at least is keeping you responsible and keeps you from looking like that bank where there's like, we're just going to run with it. So that's the behavior change. You can use those experiences as behavior change. I know for the organization, the critical infrastructure organization I was working with that had the hurricane, for them, after that, their behavior change was that their trading floor that they work with, every 2 months, I believe, or every quarter, they actually had a live recovery event where they sent the entire or half of the trading floor up to the disaster recovery facility and ran from there for a week, so that when this would potentially happen again, they were ready. And I felt really good that an organization kind of learned from that experience. So near zero isn't zero. As I mentioned, near zero participation. The idea is to aim to reduce errors. You're never going to get to zero errors, no matter how good your developers are and whatnot. But you can get there by things like incorporating user experience in your software design. Think about like how people are using your application, your system, your solution. And a lot of security issues are come by the sake of utilizing security capabilities, logins, understanding you have a lock on your browser. These are these cues to the average human that can be built in to help them reduce the errors. A lot of you are also talking about automated testing as part of your pipeline, identifies and reduces the errors before deployment. I think that's a sea change we've had with Agile, and these integrated pipelines is reduction of errors has decreased because there's tools, there's a concept that has been shared, that open, transparent concept has been shared out to folks, and they buy into it, and there are tools out there to assist with that. I remember back in the days when everything was still manual. You had a QA and QC team where they're just putting buttons through and pushing buttons, hoping that they caught everything, that they're following a script. Here you can kind of test everything, and that's great. Many of you, I'm probably preaching the choir, don't deploy directly to production. But a lot of times management, when you're trying to deploy something quickly, they won't invest in development and test environment. It's kind of funny because I've been in environments where they've cut out like a QA thing. They like test and QA is in the same thing, or development and QA are in the same thing, and you lose quality there because you haven't separated when you've gotten to a release point. And arguing for a development environment, a test and deploy pipeline is incredibly important. And if you show the value that you've reduced errors, you've gotten to zero errors, or you've increased resiliency, that stuff hasn't gone down because you're not deploying directly to production, that's a win. That's something you can turn around and use as a badge of honor. And then for major issues and incidents, I think there's a talk later today talking about doing root cause analysis, sitting down, spending time with your developers, spending time with operations people, spending time with security people, spending time with management, spending time with your communications team or even legal team to go over an incident, understand where the root causes were. It could be the fact that, as part of operations, you needed to deploy a new image out to desktops, or an endpoint protection system, or whatever. And if you just did it in a really poorly designed email, that's where your communications team could have helped participate and reduce those errors. So, Agile, the iteration process in Agile literally embodies this, and kind of cycling back, regardless of the magnitude of those particular errors or incidents that occurred, building that in, and that gets you closer to zero. It's near zero, but it's not zero, but it'll get you closer to that. And then again, finally, include proper team members. As I mentioned, including legal, including communications, including management, and definitely include, if you're doing just DevOps now, include security people. They're not the people that try to prevent things from moving forward. They're trying to prevent bad things from happening. Having been in an organization where we moved security from the tail end of finally doing a vulnerability analysis to where we're actually at the front, talking about secure coding practices, having the security team provide tools to developers so they can actually do analysis on their own, decrease the amount of time for delivery, but also, taught folks, how to do things in a very secure fashion, taught them good behaviors and good habits. And if you're not having everybody at the table, you're missing out on that experience, and you're potentially causing yourself a much more headache on the tail end.
Hey, Mark here. We're at a 5-minute warning. You pegged it exactly.
Yeah. So I want to thank all the sponsors. I can't read all the names off of those, but I appreciate the time and the effort that everyone's helped deliver on this. I see my alma mater in the corner, Carnegie Mellon. But all of us kind of learned from that. So I'm glad we have folks here to participate there. And again, all the supporters, I know a lot of you who are on here are probably members of these organizations. Thank you so very much. I appreciate the time you've given me. And again, Mark, thank you.
Well, thank you. One of the things that I took away from this, and you're going to jump into Slack with people, but it's like a general theme of your whole talk is that of evaluation of risk. And the quote that the money quote from you was, risk comes out of the financial industry, and anybody that tells you different is lying. I mean, that's a pretty powerful statement.
Yeah. You come to places here like Gartner, and they just you have the vendor floor trying to sell you the new tool, or you have a speaker there that's trying to talk about risk. But it is really like you're hedging bets. I mean, that's the whole thing, like hedge funds. They're playing one against another, and you see that with organizational politics. You're playing one team off another. You're gamifying your operations of your organization. And I think DevSecOps is cool because you've kind of created a team of awesome. You're fighting force of extraordinary magnitude because you've unified all those important key players. And basically the justification of your existence and stuff for leadership. It's like you're showing you're united front, you're playing well together. And that's a risk reduction because you're getting people to team up rather than just be, kind of those solo geniuses that you kind of slide pizza under the door and magic happens in the office. And, suddenly an application or a system appears. So that it's a good way to reduce that risk.
If you were going to tie it up right here in 1 minute, mm-hmm. What did you want people to walk away with when they heard you talk today? What were you aiming for?
Just realize that management isn't evil. I've migrated to that, but for right now, it's to understand that communication is the key to empathy. And empathy may be just this foreign concept for tech people because it's like, I'm just going to hide my feelings and I hate the world because no one understands me. But when you're willing to kind of communicate and share and meet people halfway, that is a powerful, powerful thing for folks who aren't you, who aren't technologists. And be willing to be open, be willing to share, be willing to meet the common thing of math. Sometimes, trying to push derivative math on somebody who has got some basic additive skills is not the same as somebody who's done differential equations in college as a minor. Just be willing to be open, be shared, create that empathy, and then folks will get your back.
That's awesome. Thank you. Emily's going to be over in the Slack room, the Keynote Slack room for a Q&A. Could you upload your slides when you get there too?
Yeah, sure will.
What you're going to want that. Hey, thanks so much.
Thanks.
I hope to see you soon at one of the big conferences because I know we run into